This very first module has 2 lecture units and a quiz. In this first module, you learn broadly about the field of historic preservation and why we preserve historic environments. For the quiz, you will write down your views about 10 scenarios involving historic buildings and sites. So, in the historic preservation theory class, what we investigate are these 4 questions. What is historic preservation? Why should we study it? Or how and for what should we use it? How should we study it? And then what is theory? When you say theory in historic preservation. So what is historic preservation? In a very basic way, it is taking care of historic environments. Historic environments means historic artifacts, historic buildings, townscapes, villages, landscapes, and infrastructure projects like historic bridges, historic road networks, etc. And historic preservation is also defined as curatorial management of the built world by Professor James Marsden Fitch, who wrote a book about historic preservation a long time ago, and he was a professor at Columbia University in New York, and he started pretty much the first historic preservation academic course in the United States. Now, most architects learn architectural history, and what we learn in architectural history is what happened in the past. So when we talk about historic preservation, what we are talking about is what we should do with that past right now and going into the future. History happened, architectural history happened, the buildings were designed by somebody at some particular time for a particular purpose. If the building is still there in this modern time, what are we going to do about it? And historic preservation is about that particular question. So because of that, in any architectural study, historic preservation is a significant part of any architecture curriculum in terms of architectural history, architectural theory, or architectural criticism. And there are a lot of associated terms in historic preservation. For example, the term cultural heritage, meaning that the historical environments, artifacts, and buildings that a particular given culture created in its history. So the term heritage also could be associated with the term patrimony. And then we talk about many different ways of conserving or preserving historic environments. So the terms such as conservation, restoration, heritage management, adaptive reuse, rehabilitation, recycling of historic environments, all these terms are used when we talk about the domain of historic preservation. And historic preservation also not only about architecture or planning. There are many academic disciplines that are associated with historic preservation. So in addition to architecture, anthropology, archaeology, art history, businesses, because we need money to preserve historic buildings, cultural geography, economics, engineering, museum studies, history, philosophy, planning, political science, public policy and administration, sociology, tourism, etc. There are so many academic disciplines that are associated with historic preservation. So let's get into the next question. Why should we practice historic preservation, and why should we take care of historic environments? Most important reason, I would say, is for the sustainable development. Historic buildings have been already created. They are already there. We spent a lot of energy and resources building those buildings. So why don't we preserve them, reuse them for whatever the function that we need for today? And by doing that, we maximize. Not only we save the energy and resources already embodied in the construction of historic buildings, but we can save those energy and resources for the new construction, and we can maximize the economic resources that we have already spent building those historic buildings at a historical time, and also to use whatever the economic resources that we have for new constructions. So in terms of being cost effective or in terms of being economically sustainable, Rehabilitation of old buildings is a good practice due to many reasons. Preserving historic buildings could be sometimes labor intensive. However, trying to build new buildings may cost more than that, especially because of the high cost of materials, labor, and the technology and the energy that we may have to use for the construction of new buildings. And in order to construct new buildings also, we have to pay more money to buy land for that. Now, historical buildings are already built and available, and it's much economically sustainable to use them. In order to build new buildings, if you want to demolish an existing building, that means there is money spent on the demolition of the existing building also. So by preserving historic buildings, we can save those demolition costs as well. A lot of research studies have found out that people actually like to live in historical buildings or historical areas, and they consider this is as a status symbol. So they are ready to pay higher rent or higher prices to live in those historical buildings. And in terms of time, rather than building a new building, conserving or rehabilitation of a historic building takes a shorter period of time, and it can also be done in stages. The building is already there, so you can kind of phase it out how you want to rehabilitate and reuse that building. And also, in most locations, old buildings can be purchased for a very low price. So that's an economic advantage there. And not only that, most federal, state, and local governments have provided various kind of funding and tax advantages for the preservation and reuse of old buildings. So there's those availability of funding and availability of tax advantages also make rehabilitation of old buildings very cost effective. And there's another term here called social costs. If you preserve historic environments, that means you're also preserving the memory of those places that people have. And if you are destroying an historic environment or demolishing an historic environment, you might dislocate people who have been living in those places. And if you are not taking care of the historical buildings, those may go into dilapidation. So by preserving historic environments, you try to keep their functional viability intact. You preserve the memory of those places. And by doing that, you kind of generate or maintain a social capital within those environments. So because of that, it's very, very important. And also, preserving historic buildings also save you money in terms of public costs. That means if you want to build a new area or a new suburb or new extension to a city, that means you have to extend all the infrastructure, road networks, electricity, water supplies, storage, rainwater drainage, etc. into those new areas. So you are spending more money on developing the infrastructure. In historical areas, infrastructure is already developed. So you don't need to spend money in developing those. You just have to repair and maintain those infrastructure. So in that way, you can save a lot of public funds by preserving historic areas. As I already mentioned that in the construction of historic environments, we have already spent energy and at those historical times. So by preserving historic buildings, we save those energies. And at the same time, by preserving the buildings and reusing them, we can save some of the lands that we may need to develop new buildings. And those lands could be used for other public purposes, such as parks and for recreation or any other new buildings that we really, really need to build. So those are a range of reasons, or mostly economic reasons, why we should restore and rehabilitate and preserve historic buildings. But in addition to that, there are other reasons, such as some historic places are celebratory and magnificent. Some places are rare and evoke curiosity. Some places are commemorative and associative. Some places are exemplary and instructive. Some places are pleasing and picturesque. Here are some examples. This is Taj Mahal in India. It's a magnificent place, right? So this is an incredible masterpiece of human creativity, and because of that, it deserves to be saved and made available for future generations. Pyramids in Giza, they are very rare and they evoke curiosity. And because of that, we would want to preserve those for the future generations. And some places are commemorative and associative. Now, this building is the A-bomb building in Hiroshima, the only building that survived the first nuclear attack. So this building has been saved to commemorate that particular event in the human history. This is the St. Paul's Cathedral in London, designed by Sir Christopher Wren. There are a lot of things to learn from this building about the architectural thinking in that particular era. So this building is an example and instructive of the blending of classical and Baroque styles in architectural design in the 17th century England. And some places are simply pleasing and picturesque, and their beauty itself is enough for us to preserve those areas so everybody can enjoy that beauty of that place. So when we talk about historic preservation, there are a lot of things that we need to study. First, we should study the history of the historic environment, so we have a very good idea about why it was created at that time and why it should be preserved. And then we need to study the values, meanings, and the relevance of those places for today and tomorrow. Why do we value those places? Why do we think that those places are relevant to us today or for tomorrow? So we need to study that. Then you need to study or investigate the causes of decay of the historic building. What are the areas that are decaying, that are deteriorating? What areas to be fixed? What areas do not necessarily need any fixing right now, etc. And then, depending on the condition of the building, you have to decide how to extend its life. Whatever the design decision or construction decision or decisions of repair and maintenance that you make, you should maintain the building's originality, authenticity, and value. So you have to kind of figure it out how to go about doing that. There are many strategies for that, so you have to pick one strategy or a combination of strategies to do that. Then, whatever you try to do, you need financial support for that. So you need to figure it out, the economics of this entire enterprise of curating a historic building or a historic place. And trying to take care of a historic place also means that you need some legal backing for that. There might be people living in those buildings, people who are owning those buildings. So would they like architects or even the government to come and start fixing those buildings? What kind of legal backing you have for that? So studying and working with the associated legal issues is an aspect of historic preservation. And not only that we preserve a building, but we also have to figure it out how, in today's society, people think about that building. What kind of values and meanings do people associate with those buildings? So how are we going to interpret it? How are we going to help people aware in some way the value and meaning of those preserved building? If people don't value any building, then they don't want to take care of it or even spend money doing that. So it becomes very important to create some level of public awareness about the value of those historic buildings and why those buildings should be taken care of. And then not only you preserve a historic building, but you need to keep maintaining that. So that means you have to kind of manage that curation process for a longer period of time. And in addition to preserving an historic building, there are various social, economic, and political issues associated with building. For example, a group of people in a society might not want to preserve a certain building. Another group of people in the society would want to preserve that building. So there's going to be some kind of an argument about that. And then when you preserve most of the historic areas, that land prices in those areas might go up, and that might lead to the original community leaving the place. So that would lead into gentrification. So things like that, a lot of social, economic, and political issues are associated with the preservation of historic environment. We need to understand all these issues if you are trying to preserve the historic environment. Now, all these things that I discussed in this previous slide, all these various aspects related to preservation are categorized into different historic preservation knowledge domains within the academic field of historic preservation. So, for example, in architectural history, we learn the history of the historic environment. Under historic preservation theory, we talk about those values, meanings, and relevance associated with those buildings, how to extend the value of those historical buildings, what are the ways of achieving it, what are the associated social, economic, and political issues, and also to study the history of the development of the field of historic preservation too. Because it helps us to understand how the kind of theoretical or philosophical understanding of historic preservation evolved over the course of several centuries. And then there's historic preservation planning. That is where we mostly talk about economics of historic preservation and also associated legal issues, and also how to manage preservation of large-scale historic neighborhoods and urban environments. And then comes the technological part of it, how to actually technically do a historic preservation of an old building. So that means how to do an analysis of its causes of decay and what are the strategies available and how to pick a strategy, and then how to go about doing that preservation process through various structural, material, and chemical applications. So these four domains, history, theory, planning, and technology in the historic preservation, are the ones that we use to develop a 4 core courses for the graduate certificate of historic preservation in the School of Architecture and Design. So you can see that in the Arc 646, American Architectural History, that's where we talk about the history of historic environment in the USA. Under this historic preservation theory course that you are taking right now, we'll talk about the history of the development of the field of historic preservation and various philosophies related to historic preservation, and also various debates related to historic preservation. In Arc 648, historic preservation planning, you will learn about the economics and the legislation and historic place designations and nominations, how to do those kind of things. And in Arc 649, historic preservation technology, we talked about how to analyze the decay in historic buildings, how to document historic buildings, and then what are the various preservation methods, materials, techniques, and tools available. So if you are interested in pursuing the Graduate Certificate of Historic Preservation, I highly recommend you to take these 4 core courses. They are offered both in the fall and in the spring semester. So in the Historic Preservation Theory course, within the course of this summer, what you will do is to learn about the history of the development of this particular field, its debates, its philosophies, and various social, economics, and political issues related to historic preservation. And we will talk about all these issues, not limiting to the USA, but also bringing in different examples from all over the world. So you will have a pretty good understanding of the global context of historic preservation. In order to develop that global understanding, we will talk about the UNESCO's World Heritage Program and various concepts and approaches that UNESCO developed for this World Heritage Program, and also various organizations related to this World Heritage Program, as well as various doctrinal documents in terms of conventions and charters of historic preservation that UNESCO and other international organizations and also national organizations have put together to guide the preservation practice in the world today. And this is the end of the first unit. We can go into the second unit now.